All right, welcome back to video number 2. So in the last video, we discussed classical conditioning and that first form of associative learning in which we are learning unconscious associations involving involuntary behavior. And so next, let's talk about operant conditioning. And so operant conditioning is contrasted to classical conditioning. The two kind of go hand in hand, but we're going to discuss the similarities and distinctions here. We'll do that in a little bit, but we're going to talk about operant conditioning here next. All right. So operant conditioning. So this is learning influenced by the outcomes of voluntary behavior. And so operant conditioning is based on this thing known as the law of effect. And so essentially what that states is that people generally want to do things that are rewarding in some way. It brings them pleasure, it brings them satisfaction, right? So you don't find people doing a whole lot of things that are detrimental to themselves, although there are instances of that, right? There are self-destructive behaviors and whatnot. But for the most part, people genuinely try to do things that are rewarding in some particular way. You see a picture of a dog there. Of course, operant conditioning, as we'll soon learn, doesn't just apply to humans, but animals can be conditioned as well. You know, we talked about classical conditioning with animals. Animals can also be operantly conditioned as well. So operant conditioning real basically is based in punishments and rewards. Okay. And so again, we're trying to change voluntary behaviors. What I mean by voluntary behaviors are, consciously controllable behaviors. So for instance, I can decide whether or not I want to go on a walk, and that's a conscious decision, right? Or if I want to go on a run or exercise, that is a conscious decision. Breathing, on the other hand, right, that is an unconscious process. That's not a decision, that's just a natural thing, right? So I'm making this distinction between the conscious and the unconscious. So punishments defined, those refer to outcomes that decrease the likelihood of response. So whenever we are punished in any particular way, what that's going to do, generally speaking, is it's likely to decrease that behavior, right? So your parents ground you, you're probably a lot less likely to do that behavior in the future. But of course, there are instances in which that's not effective. But that's beyond the discussion. Reinforcements work just the opposite way. Those are outcomes that actually increase the likelihood of a response. And so these two things, both punishments and reinforcements, work together to shape behavior or change behavior. Okay? Reinforcements, what we find, they seem to be more effective than punishments. So there is this whole extant literature on the effectiveness of punishment, the effectiveness of corporal punishment on children. Does it work? Does it not work? And generally, what the research shows is that reinforcements tend to be more effective. And so, if you're ever wondering, would it be better to punish the bad or praise the good? It's probably the latter if you're trying to shape behavior in a particular way. So, operant conditioning. There are 4 different types of ways to shape behavior. So we're going to go through this. We have this quadrant system down here. We have these 4 tiles or these 4 squares. On the left here, you see that we're referring to the frequency of the behavior. So if we're wanting to increase the behavior, we see these 2 panels up here. If we want to decrease the behavior, so problematic behaviors, these 2 down here. We also see these terms positive and negative, positive being in green, negative being in red. Whenever we're talking about, in this case, positive or negative, positive just real simply means to add something to the situation. Okay? So you're just adding something to the scenario, to the situation. We'll talk about that. Negative refers to removing something or taking away something from the situation. And so we're going to give examples of each, but we'll walk through this quadrant here. So positive reinforcement. So that happens whenever we want to increase a behavior. And the way in which we do that is we offer some sort of reward. So an example would be like giving a gold star on homework, resulting in a student studying more, right? So it's reinforcement in that you're trying to increase that behavior, right? So you want the child to continue doing well in their homework. And it's positive. The reason why it's positive reinforcement is because you're giving a gold star, right? So you're adding something to the scenario in that case. Okay. Let's go to negative reinforcement. We can also reinforce behaviors by taking away something that is basically undesirable, okay? So in this case here, negative reinforcement, we're trying to increase the behavior by taking away something. So an example would be, for instance, saying that, you know, a child doesn't have to do their chores this week because they got an A on a test, right? So you did so well on your test that, you know, you don't have to do chores for this week. And so in this case here, we're taking something away. So in this case, we're taking away an obligation or a household responsibility that a child has to encourage that behavior and say, hey, keep it up. You know, you're doing a good job in school. Keep up the good work. So whenever we want to decrease a behavior, as I mentioned before, we implement punishments, or we can implement punishments. So there's what's known as a positive punishment, which means that we are basically adding the punishment or providing something that is undesirable. Okay. So an example would be like a scolding by a pet owner, reducing a dog's habit of chewing on shoes. And so in this very sad scenario, a pet owner might yell at a dog because the dog was chewing on shoes. You're trying to decrease that behavior. That's an unpleasant example, right? But that is an example of positive punishment. Negative punishment. Finally, what that involves or what that entails is taking away something to punish an individual. And so, for instance, taking away a favorite toy, stopping a child from throwing a temper tantrum, right? And so, you know, by taking away that favorite toy that's unpleasant for the child, they are less likely to have a temper tantrum in the future. Okay? So again, here we are trying to shape behavior, and we are doing this for voluntary behaviors. So in relation to classical conditioning, we discussed Ivan Pavlov, we discussed John B. Watson. I want you to associate operant conditioning with a guy by the name of B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner. He was a very famous psychologist. He was a behaviorist as well. But again, he dealt with voluntary behaviors. And this next video here discusses his own little unique invention known as the Skinner box, which he used to operantly condition animals. So let's watch this video.
While some scientists engineer shiny new consumer goods for an eager public, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner seeks nothing less than the engineering of human nature. In experiments with subjects as simple as pigeons, Skinner declares that with the right social engineering, we can create a new breed of human being. Skinner is firmly in the behaviorist tradition pioneered by John Watson in the 1920s. Like Watson, Skinner contends that with the right tools, we can predict and control behavior.
Skinner really inherited the mantle from Watson of behaviorism in this country. But it's kind of interesting to think about how there's a subtle difference in the way they went about it. Watson, as we know, ended up becoming an advertising executive, ended up embracing the American value system as it existed. Skinner was different. Skinner was a visionary. Skinner felt that through behaviorism, he could influence the world towards a greater humanity, not meet humanity where it was, but take humanity to a new place through the principles of behaviorism.
Picking up where Watson left off, Skinner wants to do the rigorous science to prove that environment is everything. Change the environment, he argues, and you can change the individual. Or in Skinner's case, the pigeon.
Skinner himself was a born gadgeteer. He had in his own early years. As a boy, for example, he developed ways of sorting ripe, I think it was cranberries, from unripe cranberries. He invented a cannon that would shoot things over his neighbor's fence. This was the kind of man he was. He was developing new ways to do everyday things in ways that were more comfortable, more efficient.
During World War II, Skinner had developed a pigeon guidance device for the U.S. military. While the Russians had dogs carrying bombs, and the Swedes had seals to blow up mines, Skinner had a plan of his own. Teaching pigeons to guide missiles to an enemy target. At the time, however, the military had no missiles to guide. But Skinner's pigeon research did not go to waste. He develops a system called Operant Conditioning to prove that a behavior will be repeated by a subject when rewarded. Repetition leads to reinforcement. Reinforcement to changes in behavior.
This hungry pigeon is moving about more or less at random. Sometimes it turns its head to the left. When it does, we reinforce that movement by giving the pigeon access to a dish of grain.
Skinner then waits for it to turn further. Again, more food. Ultimately, the pigeon will turn in a complete circle, having learned that only when he turns will he be rewarded.
What Skinner was able to do in very carefully controlled studies with animal models was to demonstrate that whole chains of behaviors could be built step by step, so that literally you could teach a pigeon to do complicated behaviors that no one would have predicted possible.
And Skinner believes that if it works for pigeons, why not people? In Skinner's mind, behavior is behavior, up and down the evolutionary scale, and it is all learned. One of the great successes is in education. People are taught to do more complicated tasks than anyone had thought possible by breaking down behavior into small steps and giving positive reinforcement along the way.
The essence of Skinner's work was that we could manipulate the environment in ways that would permit us to produce any kind of behavior that we wished, and we could develop individuals in ways that made every possible future open to them.
The idea that anything is...
So that was a little video on B.F. Skinner. You saw his Skinner box and how he was able to condition a pigeon to just turn left, and the pigeon eventually learned that that voluntary behavior would be rewarded, so it was operantly conditioned. Okay. So next I want to talk about operant conditioning and something known as reinforcement schedules. So again, reinforcement, that's whenever we're trying to increase the likelihood of a particular behavior. Now, you can do something known as continuous reinforcement, which means that every time an animal or organism performs the desired behavior or action, it is rewarded, okay? But sometimes we don't do that for a variety of reasons, right? So we might not reward a dog for every good behavior, but rather just occasional behaviors. So whenever we occasionally offer a reinforcer, this is known as a partial reinforcement schedule. Okay, so we're reinforcing response only part of the time. This results maybe in a slower acquisition of the response, but much greater resistance to extinction. So that's an interesting point. It's actually more resilient to the process of extinction, which we talked about earlier in the classical conditioning video, compared to a continuous reinforcement schedule. So just like the quadrant we saw earlier, we're going to have another quadrant here. So we're going to walk through 4 different types of reinforcement schedules. So first there is, we'll break it down. We have ratio over here and interval. Ratio refers to number of responses, whereas interval refers to intervals of time. So one is numerically based, again, number of behaviors. One is time-based, so how much time has passed. Fixed up here refers to it is unchanging, so that's what fixed means. It is unchanging, unwavering. Whereas variable means just that, it varies. And so we're gonna basically talk about these 4 different types of schedules here next. So fixed ratio. This refers to a completion of a constant number of responses. And so an example might be, I give a dog a treat every 5 times he or she sits. So on the 5th response, on the 10th response, on the 15th, and so on and so forth, I offer a treat, but never on the 18th. Right? Variable ratio, on the other hand, this is changing or completing of a changing number of responses. And so it might be variable, right? So it's unpredictable. The dog might get a treat on the 3rd trial or the 4th trial or the 5th trial. You know, it is variable, it is random, okay? Fixed interval, so the reinforces the first response after a constant amount of time, okay? So for instance, I might offer a reinforcer every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or so on and so forth. And so this is time-based, and it is fixed because it is unchanging, right? And then there is variable interval, reinforces the first response after a changing amount of time. So kind of similar idea. You might get a reinforcer, you know, after 2 minutes, after 3 minutes. It is unpredictable and it is variable. Okay. So one classic example of a variable ratio reinforcement schedule is slot machines, right? So you walk up to a slot machine, if you've ever been to a casino, you pull the lever, and you may or may not win on your first try or your second try or your 3rd try. But nevertheless, a lot of people become addicted to these slot machines because of this very powerful reinforcement schedule. Okay. So here we see reinforcement schedules, and we have the 4 here on this graph. Here we have time here in minutes. So we're looking at the interval, the 2 interval schedules over here on the right. Number of responses here, we're looking at the fixed ratio, variable ratio here on the left. And basically what we see is that every time you see a black little tick here, that indicates that a reinforcer has been provided, okay, at that particular moment in time, okay? And so fixed ratio, we see that there is just the steady offering of reinforcers. It is predictable, and you see that behavior kind of increases here in a predictable manner. Variable ratio, you see that it is, you see the tick marks here are kind of random, they're kind of dispersed. This is a very powerful schedule for reinforcement as well. Over here on the right, we're looking at the interval scale, so this is time-based. Variable interval, this produces basically steady responding in the organism. Whereas with fixed interval, what's interesting is that you'll see an uptick in the behavior leading immediately to or prior to the reinforcer, followed by a period of stability. And so it is not as steady, say, as the variable interval. But again, we see these different schedules here at work. All of them seem to be effective, but some more so than others. Okay, and our final slide for this video, we're just comparing and contrasting operant conditioning. So classical conditioning, the basic idea, so the organism associates events. With operant conditioning, the organism associates behavior and the resulting events. The response is involuntary and automatic. In the case of operant conditioning, voluntary and operates on the environment. Acquisition, so we're associating events here. The neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus and becomes the conditioned stimulus. Whereas with operant conditioning, associating a response with a consequence, so either a reinforcer or a punisher. Extinction, the conditioned response decreases when conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented alone. Whereas with operant conditioning, responding decreases when reinforcement stops. So as soon as the reinforcer stops, so too does behavior typically. But again, it depends on what schedule might be used. With spontaneous recovery, the reappearance after arrest of an undistinguished condition response, the reappearance after arrest period of an extinguished response. With generalization, the tendency to respond to stimuli similar to the condition stimulus. With operant conditioning, organisms' response to similar stimuli is also reinforced. And finally, with discrimination, the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that does not signal an unconditioned stimulus. Ooh, this is a mouthful. I probably shouldn't have read all this, but and then finally, organism learns that certain responses, but not others, will be reinforced. And so I don't know why I walked through all that. I do apologize, but this is a good table just to compare and contrast the two forms of conditioning. Down here, by the way, we have our three kind of big figures we talked about: Pavlov, John B. Watson, who did classical conditioning, and then operant conditioning was B.F. Skinner. Right? So that's all I have for you for this video. The last video, we're going to discuss observational learning. We'll discuss a few kind of just random topics in relation to learning. And so stay tuned.